The night was calm but alive, the kind of night when city lights painted golden reflections on the wet pavement. Music drifted out from the corner of a busy street, laughter mixed with the sound of cars passing by. People were gathered outside a well-known nightclub, talking, smiling, and taking pictures. No one knew that within a few minutes, something unexpected was about to unfold, something that would make headlines by morning. Mike Tyson had been inside the club for a charity event. Nothing wild, nothing loud. He had changed a lot over the years. The man who once ruled boxing rings with thunder in his fists was now known for his calmness, his kindness, and his surprising humor. That night he had spent hours talking to fans, shaking hands, and signing gloves for an auction that would raise money for kids in need. When he finally stepped outside, the air felt lighter. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards, just a few friends walking behind him. He had learned to keep things simple, to enjoy normal moments that once felt impossible. Across the street, a young police officer was sitting in his patrol car, scanning the area. It was his third shift in a row. He was tired, stressed, and eager to prove himself. He had joined the force with a dream of helping people, but lately he had felt lost under pressure. Pressure to be fast, to be tough, to make quick decisions. His eyes caught a small group near the entrance of the club. The crowd was growing louder, phones flashing. He couldn't tell what was happening, but he assumed the worst. Without thinking much, he stepped out of his car and started walking toward them. Tyson was just greeting someone when he noticed the flashing lights in the corner of his eye. At first, he didn't think much of it. It was normal to see officers around busy streets at night, but his friends noticed the officer's pace, firm, sharp, filled with tension. One of them whispered, "Hey, man, I think he's coming this way." Tyson turned, calm as always. His hands relaxed by his sides. The officer reached the edge of the crowd and shouted, "Hey, step back!" His voice cut through the laughter, startling people. The crowd froze. Tyson looked at him, confused. "Everything okay, officer?" he asked in his quiet tone. The officer's adrenaline was already high. He didn't recognize the man in front of him. In his eyes, it was just a big guy surrounded by people, maybe causing a disturbance. The officer's hand rested on his baton. Someone from the crowd tried to explain. "It's Mike Tyson, man. He's not doing anything." But the words didn't register. The officer's training had taught him to act fast, not to think too long. He moved closer, shouting again, "Back away!" The crowd began recording, sensing something was off. The flashing lights of cell phones mixed with the red and blue glow from the patrol car. Tyson raised one hand slightly, showing calm. "Officer, I'm just leaving. There's no problem here." His tone was even, respectful. But in the officer's mind, that movement, even though gentle, looked like defiance. In that split second, he swung the baton, striking Tyson on the arm. A sharp sound echoed through the air. Not loud, but heavy enough to make the entire street go silent. The crowd gasped. One woman covered her mouth. A man shouted, "And what are you doing?" The officer froze, realizing what he had just done. Tyson took a step back, shocked but composed. His eyes, usually soft, grew still and focused. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. He just looked at the officer, not with anger, but with deep disbelief. The officer's heart dropped. The light hit Tyson's face fully now, and he finally saw who was standing in front of him. His breath caught in his throat. His hand trembled. It wasn't just anyone. It was the former heavyweight champion of the world, one of the most recognizable men on the planet. A man who could end a fight in seconds, yet hadn't lifted a finger in defense. Tyson slowly lowered his arm, his expression unreadable. He took a slow breath, then said quietly, "You didn't have to do that, man." The tone in his voice wasn't angry. It was disappointed, almost fatherly. The crowd began to whisper, some recording, others yelling at the officer. "He hit Tyson. Oh, he's in trouble now. That cop's done." The officer took a step back, his mind spinning. "Sir, I thought I didn't realize—" He stammered, but the words tangled on his tongue. Tyson didn't move closer. He simply looked at him for a moment longer before turning slightly toward the crowd. "It's fine," he said, his voice calm but steady. "Everybody just relax. No one needs to make this worse." That one sentence changed everything. The crowd quieted, surprised by his composure. The officer looked like he wanted to disappear. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had made it in front of dozens of witnesses, cameras pointed right at him. Tyson could have exploded. could have humiliated him right there, but instead, he took control of the moment with patience that only comes from someone who has seen the worst sides of life. One of Tyson's friends stepped forward. "Mike, you okay?" Tyson nodded. "Yeah, man, I'm good. Let's just go." The officer tried to speak again, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I swear I didn't mean to." Tyson turned his head slightly, his gaze softer now. "You got scared," he said. "It happens. Just next time, take a second before you act." The officer didn't know what to say. His training hadn't prepared him for this, for being forgiven by the very person he had wronged. His hands were shaking as he lowered his baton completely. The tension in his shoulders gave way to guilt. People were still recording, but the tone had changed. Some began saying, "Man, Tyson handled that like a legend. He didn't even get mad. That's real control." Tyson walked toward his car slowly. Every step was deliberate, calm. His friend opened the door and he got in quietly. Before driving off, he looked out the window one last time at the officer, who was now standing alone under the flashing lights, trying to process what had just happened. Tyson could have stayed and argued, but he knew there was no point. He had spent years learning to control his anger, to choose peace over pride. This was one more test, and he had passed it. As the car pulled away, the crowd slowly began to disperse. The officer stood frozen for a long time, his heart still pounding. He knew the videos would spread by morning. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, but what stayed with him most wasn't the fear of losing his job. It was the look in Tyson's eyes. Not hate, not fury, just disappointment that cut deeper than any punishment could. A few minutes later, another officer arrived asking what had happened. The young cop didn't answer right away. He just sighed, looking down at the baton still in his hand. "I messed up," he said quietly. "I didn't even think." His partner didn't respond. He had already heard the whispers from the bystanders. The truth was out, and the world would soon see the video. Meanwhile, Tyson sat in the back seat of the car, staring out at the city lights. His friend asked softly, "You sure you're okay?" Tyson nodded slowly. "Yeah, I've been through worse," he said. Then after a pause, he added, "But it's sad, you know. Some people are so scared all the time they can't even see what's in front of them." His voice carried both sadness and wisdom, the kind that only comes from surviving years of chaos and finding peace through it. As they drove off, his phone buzzed with messages. Word was already spreading. His team wanted to know what happened, reporters were calling, fans were posting. Tyson sighed, not angry, just tired. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "I don't need to prove anything." Back at the station, the officer sat at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. His supervisor had already called him in. His radio was buzzing with chatter and a report needed to be filed. But he couldn't move. His mind replayed the moment over and over, and the swing of the baton, the look in Tyson's eyes, the quiet voice that said, "You didn't have to do that." He felt sick. For the first time in his short career, he wasn't afraid of punishment. He was ashamed of himself. That night, two men from completely different worlds crossed paths, one driven by fear, the other guided by calm strength. It could have ended badly, but sometimes real power doesn't come from fighting back. It comes from choosing not to. As the city settled into silence, one thing was clear. The story wasn't over. By morning, everyone would know what had happened. The officer's world was about to change, and so was his understanding of what true strength really looked like. The morning after the incident, the city was buzzing with a story that had already spread faster than anyone could have imagined. Social media was flooded with clips from that night. Different angles, different voices, but all showing the same thing. A young police officer swinging his baton and hitting Mike Tyson, followed by Tyson's calm, almost gentle reaction. The internet exploded with opinions. Some were furious, others amazed by Tyson's composure. News channels replayed the clip with headlines like, "Mike Tyson shows remarkable restraint," and "Officer hits the wrong man." At first, Tyson didn't even check his phone. He had gone for his morning walk like he always did. Headphones in, hoodie pulled up. He liked quiet mornings. They reminded him that peace wasn't something you found outside. It was something you built inside. As he walked past a few people jogging, he noticed a couple whispering and pointing at their phones. He already knew what it was about. He sighed softly but kept walking. Back at his house, his assistant had the news on. The clip was everywhere. "You need to say something," his assistant said. "Everyone's waiting for your response." Tyson just nodded, took a seat, and watched the screen for a while. He saw the moment of the strike, the crowd's reaction, his own face. For a few seconds, he didn't say a word. Then he turned the TV off. "The video says enough," he murmured. Meanwhile, at the police station, the young officer sat at his desk with his head in his hands. He hadn't slept all night. Every few minutes, another message or notification would pop up on his phone. His name wasn't public yet, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. His captain had already called him into the office earlier that morning. The meeting had been short and cold. "You'll be placed on leave while we investigate," the captain said. There wasn't any anger in his voice, just disappointment. The officer couldn't even argue. He just nodded, signed the paperwork, and walked out quietly. As he stepped outside, cameras were already waiting. He covered his face and hurried to his car, his mind spinning with regret. Across town, Tyson sat in his backyard sipping tea and staring at the sunlight reflecting off the pool. One of his friends dropped by, shaking his head. "Man, it's all over the internet. People can't believe how calm you were." Tyson smiled faintly. "That's the funny part," he said. "They think staying calm is easy, but you have no idea how many years it took me to learn that." His friend nodded. Tyson leaned back in his chair. "I used to be angry all the time. I thought power was about making people fear you. Now I know it's about making people feel safe around you." That officer, he wasn't trying to be bad. He was scared. Fear makes people do foolish things. That afternoon, Tyson finally agreed to speak. He didn't call a press conference or write a long statement. Instead, he posted a short video from his living room. He looked straight into the camera and said in a calm voice, "Last night something happened that could have turned ugly. But it didn't. I'm okay. The officer made a mistake. We all do. I'm not angry. I just hope it reminds people, especially those in power, that calm can stop chaos before it starts." The video lasted less than a minute, but it went viral instantly. Millions shared it, praising his grace and self-control. Comments poured in from around the world. That's real strength. Tyson's a legend for this. He handled it better than most people ever could. The officer watched that video too, sitting alone in his small apartment. He couldn't believe it. After everything, Tyson had forgiven him. Not only that, but he had defended him without even saying his name. It should have made him feel relieved, but instead, it made the guilt hit even harder. Later that night, the officer's phone rang. It was his father. There was a long silence before the older man spoke. "Son, I saw the video. I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you need to face this. Don't hide. Make it right." The next day, the officer went to the precinct, not in uniform, but in a plain shirt. He asked his captain if he could meet Tyson personally to apologize. The captain raised an eyebrow. "You think he'll want to see you?" The officer hesitated. "Maybe not, but I have to try." Word got to Tyson's team within a few hours. They were hesitant at first, but Tyson agreed. "If he wants to talk, I'll listen," he said simply. When the two men finally met a few days later, it was in a quiet office away from cameras. No media, no crowd, no recording, just a private meeting. The officer stood nervously by the door, holding his hat in his hands. Tyson walked in wearing a casual tracksuit and nodded politely. For a moment, neither spoke. The officer finally broke the silence. "I wanted to apologize. I acted too fast. I didn't even stop to see who you were. I was scared and I handled it wrong." Tyson looked at him quietly for a few seconds before replying, "You know, when you hit me, I wasn't even angry. I was surprised, sure, but mostly I felt sorry for you. You looked like someone fighting more with yourself than with me." The officer swallowed hard. "I was. I've been on the job for a year and I've already seen things that mess with your head. I let that fear take over." Tyson nodded slowly. "Fear is powerful. It makes people forget who they are. But the fact that you're here means you're trying to remember." He reached out and shook the officer's hand. "Learn from it. That's all any of us can do." The officer didn't know what to say. He just nodded, grateful, and whispered, "Thank you." When Tyson left the room, the officer sat down, feeling something he hadn't felt in months: peace. Outside that small meeting, the world continued to talk. News anchors called it a lesson in humility and forgiveness. Social media buzzed with positive messages for days. People said the moment showed what true strength looked like: Not in a punch, not in anger, but in calm understanding. Tyson, on the other hand, didn't care much about the headlines. He returned to his normal life, his training, his podcast, his family. But in interviews that followed, he spoke about the incident from time to time. "That cop wasn't a bad guy," he said once during an interview. "He was just afraid. The world's full of fear. If we start fighting fear with anger, we'll never stop fighting. Someone has to stop first." Those words reached far beyond boxing fans. Teachers, community leaders, and even police departments shared his message. Some stations even used the incident as part of their training, showing how restraint and awareness could change everything in a split second. The young officer eventually returned to work months later, but he wasn't the same. He carried himself differently, quieter, more careful, more aware. He started volunteering at youth programs, teaching kids about patience and control. Whenever someone asked him about the Tyson incident, he didn't make excuses. He would just say, "It taught me more about myself than any training ever could." For Tyson, it was another reminder of how far he had come. He had lived through fame, fear, and mistakes of his own. But this time, he wasn't the man people feared. He was the man who gave others hope that people could change. One evening, Tyson was out for dinner when a young man approached him shyly. "Hey, Mr. Tyson," the man said. "I just wanted to thank you. My brother's a police officer. He watched that video of you and said it made him think about how he handles people. You might have saved someone's life, you know." Tyson smiled, shook the man's hand, and replied softly, "That's all I ever wanted, to help someone learn before it's too late." The man nodded and walked away, leaving Tyson in thought. He looked around the restaurant, people laughing, talking, just living their lives. He smiled to himself. A few years ago, a moment like that might have turned into chaos. Now it had turned into something peaceful, even inspiring. Sometimes life gives people moments that test what they've learned. Tyson had been tested countless times in his life, in the ring, in his past, in his own mind. But this test was different. It wasn't about strength or speed. It was about control, grace, and forgiveness. And for once, the fight wasn't against another man. It was against the old version of himself. The city eventually moved on, the story fading from the headlines. But for those who had witnessed it, both in person and online, it stayed as a quiet lesson. A reminder that not every story of conflict has to end in chaos. Sometimes it can end in understanding. And somewhere in that balance between fear and forgiveness, a former champion had proven once again that real power doesn't come from what you can do. It comes from what you choose not to do. Weeks passed since the night that shook the internet. The clip of the officer hitting Tyson had stopped trending, but it hadn't disappeared. It was one of those stories people kept coming back to, not because of the mistake, but because of how it ended. People weren't talking about anger anymore. They were talking about grace, about what it meant to stay calm when everything around you was falling apart. Tyson had gone back to his daily life, but something about the whole situation stayed in his mind. He had seen how fast people could judge, how quick the world was to attack, and he didn't want that officer to become another target. He knew what it was like to be hated publicly, to have people twist your story. So when reporters tried to get him to say something negative about the cop, he refused every time. "That man doesn't need more punishment," he told one journalist. "He needs understanding." The comment went viral, of course. It wasn't what people expected from Mike Tyson, the same man who once terrified opponents in the ring. But that was the point. He had spent years learning to control his emotions, to grow from his past. To him, every mistake was a lesson waiting to be understood. Meanwhile, the officer had been placed on desk duty for a while. He wasn't allowed to patrol the streets until the investigation was over. His days were quiet now, filing reports, answering phones, sitting at a desk while other officers came and went. But something inside him had changed. He wasn't bitter or defensive. He just wanted to learn. He started reading more about emotional control, about how fear could influence decision-making. He even attended a few counseling sessions the department offered. At first it felt awkward. He wasn't used to talking about his feelings. But little by little he began to open up. "I didn't just hit a man that night," he said to the counselor. "I hit my own sense of who I was supposed to be." The counselor smiled softly and told him, "Then maybe it's time to rebuild that." A few months later, the officer received a letter. Not from the department, not from the press, but from Tyson himself. It wasn't long, just a few sentences. We all lose control sometimes. What matters is what we do after that. You've got a chance to turn it into something better. Don't waste it." The officer read that letter over and over again. It felt like someone had handed him a second chance and he didn't want to let it go to waste. Tyson, too, was thinking about what to do next. He had been working on a podcast for a while, one where he talked about life, mistakes, and redemption. He decided to dedicate one episode to what had happened, not to retell the event, but to talk about the bigger picture. When the episode went live, millions tuned in. Tyson sat calmly in front of the microphone, his voice deep and steady. "A lot of people think strength is about what you can do to others," he said. "But I've learned that real strength is about what you can hold back. When that officer hit me, it wasn't about him and me. It was about all of us. It was about what fear does to people. I've lived with fear my whole life. The difference is I've learned how to face it instead of letting it control me." Listeners around the world flooded the comments with support. Some said the episode brought them to tears. Others said it helped them forgive someone in their own lives. Tyson didn't do it for praise, though. He did it because he knew words had power, the same kind of power that once destroyed him, but now helped him heal. Around that time, a journalist requested to interview both Tyson and the officer together. It was a bold idea, putting them in the same room on camera. At first, both men hesitated. Tyson didn't like the idea of turning it into a show, and the officer didn't want to seem like he was chasing sympathy. But after thinking it over, they agreed. Not for fame, but to send a message. The interview took place in a small studio, simple and quiet. There was no dramatic lighting, no fake setup, just two chairs facing each other, a small table, and a couple of cameras. The interviewer began softly. "When you look back on that night, what do you feel now?" The officer took a deep breath before answering. "Regret," he said honestly. "Not because of what happened to me after, but because I let fear make me forget what my job really is, to protect people, not to hurt them." "That night taught me more than any training ever did," Tyson nodded slowly. "Fear is a heavy thing," he replied. "It makes you act before you think." But when I saw his face after he realized what he'd done, I saw something familiar. I saw myself years ago, making mistakes, losing control, learning the hard way. The interviewer asked Tyson, "Did you ever feel angry?" Tyson smiled faintly. "For a second, maybe. But anger doesn't solve anything. If I'd reacted with anger, people would have only remembered that. They would have said Tyson lost control again, but I didn't want that. I wanted to show that you can be strong and still be kind." The conversation went on for nearly an hour. Both men spoke openly, no scripts, no rehearsed answers. By the end, the officer looked lighter, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. When the cameras stopped rolling, Tyson stood up and gave him a firm handshake. "You'll be fine," he said. "Just keep walking the right path." The interview aired a few days later and became one of the most talked about clips of the year. People shared it everywhere, calling it the conversation everyone needed to hear. Schools used it in discussions about self-control and emotional awareness. Even police academies played it during training, showing how a single mistake could become a turning point for change. The officer started speaking at community events after that. Not as a hero, but as someone who had learned a lesson. He would tell young recruits, "Every time you face a situation, remember that the person in front of you is human first. Take a breath before you act. You can't undo a moment, but you can prevent a bad one." Tyson, too, kept using his platform for good. He began visiting youth centers again, talking to kids about choices, about staying grounded no matter how much the world tries to push you. He shared his story openly, from his past mistakes to the man he had become. "Life is about control," he told them. "Not of others, but of yourself." Months later, the two crossed paths again at a charity event for underprivileged kids. It wasn't planned. Tyson was there to speak, and the officer had been invited to help with security. When they saw each other, they both laughed. Tyson walked over and said, "We meet again." The officer smiled nervously, hopefully under better circumstances this time. Tyson chuckled. "Way better," he said, giving him a friendly pat on the shoulder. For a few minutes, they stood side by side, watching the kids play basketball in the gym. It was a quiet, almost poetic moment. Two men who had met in chaos now standing together in peace. The officer looked at Tyson and said softly, "You know, that night changed my life. I don't think I'll ever forget it. Tyson nodded. Good. Some things are meant to stay with you, not to haunt you, but to remind you of who you are now. As the event went on, Tyson gave a short speech. He didn't mention the incident directly, but everyone in the room knew what he was referring to when he said, "We all have moments when we lose ourselves. What matters is finding our way back. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's freedom." The crowd applauded, and even the officer found himself smiling. For the first time in months, he felt proud, not of what had happened, but of what he had done since. He knew he still had a long road ahead, but at least he was walking it the right way. That night, as Tyson left the event, a reporter asked him if he still thought about that night with the officer. Tyson paused for a moment before answering. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't happen. That's the part people forget. It could have gone wrong in so many ways, but it didn't, and that's something to be thankful for." The reporter nodded, and Tyson walked away, his car disappearing into the night. In the end, the story wasn't about a punch or a headline. It was about two people who could have let one mistake define them, but instead they chose to turn it into something better. One learned humility, the other showed forgiveness, and together they reminded the world that even in moments of conflict, there's always room for grace. Months had passed since the interview that brought Tyson and the officer together again. The world had slowly moved on, but the story still lived quietly in people's minds. It had turned from a moment of shock into a lesson about patience and forgiveness. Whenever someone mentioned it now, they didn't talk about the hit. They talked about how Tyson handled it and how the officer learned from it. Tyson's life was as busy as ever. Between his podcast, his family, and his work with charities, he barely had time to rest. But he liked it that way. Staying busy kept him grounded. He often said, "Idle time is dangerous time." It reminded him of his past, of the years when he had too much time to think and too little control over his emotions. Now he filled his days with purpose. The officer's life had changed in quiet but meaningful ways too. He had gone back to working in the community, not as a regular street cop, but as part of a new outreach program. The department had started it after the incident, hoping to build better trust between police and the public. When they asked him to join, he said yes without hesitation. At first it was strange. People still recognized him sometimes. They'd whisper or point, some even asked if he really hit Tyson. He never denied it. "Yes, sir," he would say, "and it was the worst mistake of my life, but also the most important one." Those words usually made people pause. There was honesty in them, the kind that didn't need defending. Every week he visited schools and youth centers talking to kids about staying calm under pressure. He told them stories from his job, not just about danger but about decisions. "Every choice you make has a ripple," he'd say. "You might not see it right away, but it'll come back to you." Sometimes he'd see Tyson's video clips used in those same schools, the interview, the podcast, the quotes about self-control. It always made him smile. It felt strange, knowing that one bad moment had somehow turned into something that helped others. One afternoon, Tyson received a letter from a high school principal in another state. The students had been studying real-life examples of emotional intelligence, and they chose his story as their main discussion topic. The letter thanked him for showing that strength wasn't just about muscles or fame, it was about humility. Tyson smiled as he read it. He kept the letter on his desk. That night during dinner, he brought it up. "You know," he said, "I never thought something that ugly could turn into something good." One of his friends laughed. "That's life, man. Sometimes the biggest lessons come from the ugliest moments." Tyson nodded slowly. "Yeah, I just hope that officer's doing okay." He had the courage to face it. Most people would have just run from it. Around that same time, the officer had been invited to speak at a police conference. He was nervous. It was his first time addressing other officers about what had happened. The auditorium was filled with hundreds of uniforms, people from all over the country. When his turn came, he walked up to the podium, took a deep breath, and started speaking. He didn't use fancy words or try to sound perfect. He told the story exactly as it was. The mistake, the fear, the realization, the forgiveness. He spoke about how that night changed his understanding of what it meant to wear the badge. "Being a cop isn't about being the strongest," he said. "It's about being the calmest. If you can stay calm when everyone else loses control, that's real power." When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then people began to applaud, not because of his story, but because of his honesty. Several officers came up afterward to thank him. Some even said his story made them think differently about how they handled tense situations. For the first time since that night, he felt like he was truly making a difference. Back in Los Angeles, Tyson was preparing for a charity fight. Not a real one, just an exhibition to raise money for youth programs. The event was huge, with celebrities, athletes, and fans filling the arena. Before the match started, the announcer shared a short video montage of Tyson's life, from his early days in the ring to his challenges and growth. One clip showed a brief shot of the night outside the nightclub, followed by his calm response to the officer. The crowd cheered loudly, not because of the fight that never happened, but because of the man Tyson had become. After the event, Tyson was surrounded by people taking pictures and congratulating him. But in the middle of all that noise, his phone buzzed. It was a text from the officer. It simply read, "Just watched the event. You looked happy. Thanks for showing me what strength really means." Tyson smiled and typed back, "Keep doing good things. That's how you win the real fights." The two men didn't talk often, but they kept in touch from time to time. Short messages, simple check-ins. They didn't need to be friends in a traditional sense. They just shared a strange, unspoken bond. It was the kind of connection that could only come from living through something life-changing together. A few weeks later, the officer was invited to join a community project run by a local boxing gym. The gym worked with teenagers who were at risk of dropping out of school or getting into trouble. When he walked in for the first time, the smell of sweat and leather hit him. The same smell that had once defined Tyson's whole world. He looked around and smiled. "Guess I'm in the right place," he thought. The kids were rowdy at first, not taking him seriously. But after a few sessions, they started to listen. He didn't talk to them like an officer. He talked like someone who had made mistakes and learned from them. "Life will test your patience," he told them. "If you lose your temper, you lose your control. And if you lose control, you lose everything." One of the gym coaches later told Tyson about it, saying, "That officer you met, he's been helping kids down here. He's good with them." Tyson smiled when he heard it. "That's what I was hoping for," he said. Time went on, and both men found peace in their separate lives. Tyson kept working on his podcast, talking about second chances, forgiveness, and mental strength. The officer continued helping his community, trying to be an example of change from within. They had both grown from one split-second moment that could have ruined everything, but instead, it made them better. A year after the incident, a documentary filmmaker approached Tyson about turning the story into a short film. Tyson hesitated at first. "I don't want it to look like a publicity stunt," he said. But after some thought, he agreed, on one condition, that the story focused not on him but on the lesson. When the documentary came out, it wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was simple and heartfelt. It showed the full journey, the mistake, the forgiveness, and the quiet transformation that followed. It ended with Tyson saying, "I used to fight people to prove I was strong. Now I stay calm to prove I've grown." The documentary received praise everywhere. Teachers used it in classrooms. Police academies showed it during training. Even mental health programs shared it as an example of how to handle confrontation with compassion. Tyson was humbled by the response. He said in an interview later, "If my pain can help someone else find peace, then it was worth it." The officer watched the film privately at home. When the end credits rolled, he sat there for a long time thinking. His eyes were wet, but he wasn't sad. He was grateful that the worst night of his life had somehow led him to a better version of himself. Not long after, he wrote a short message on his social media page, something he had never done before. It read, "I made a mistake once that could have cost me everything, but it also gave me a chance to rebuild. To anyone who feels lost, remember it's never too late to be better." Thousands of people liked and shared the post. Some even commented, saying his words gave them hope. That night, as Tyson scrolled through his phone before bed, he came across the post by accident. He read it, smiled, and whispered to himself, "That's growth." Both men had moved beyond their pasts, not by forgetting what happened, but by using it to shape something new. They had shown that forgiveness could be stronger than anger, that compassion could change lives more deeply than punishment ever could. And though the world had long since moved on from that single night outside the club, the story kept living quietly, in classrooms, in training sessions, in conversations between fathers and sons, between teachers and students. It became more than a viral video. It became a reminder that sometimes the real fight isn't the one that happens in the ring or on the street. It's the one that happens inside the heart, and winning that one is what truly makes a person strong. Time had passed since that fateful night when everything had spiraled out of control. For most of the world, the story of the officer hitting Mike Tyson had faded into the background, replaced by the next viral video, the next trending headline. But for the two men at the center of it, the experience had left a lasting mark. It wasn't just a story about a mistake anymore. It had become a lesson in life, a reminder of how people could change if they chose to. Tyson, as always, stayed busy. His podcast had grown more popular than ever, not just for boxing fans, but for anyone looking for wisdom from someone who had lived through extremes. He spoke openly about his past, his failures, and the moments when he had felt powerless. But the story that seemed to resonate most with his listeners was the one that began with fear and ended in forgiveness. The night the officer had hit him with a baton, he often received messages from people all over the world. Some thanked him for showing patience in a moment of anger. Others shared personal stories about mistakes they had made and how Tyson's example had inspired them to handle things differently. He would read them quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes quietly wiping away a small tear. For him, these messages were more valuable than any recognition he could have earned in the ring. Meanwhile, the officer had fully embraced his new path. His life had changed in ways he could never have imagined when he first swung that baton. He had started speaking regularly at schools, community centers, and even police training programs. His honesty, humility, and willingness to admit mistakes made people listen. He no longer tried to defend what he had done. Instead, he used it as a teaching moment, showing others that even a single error could become an opportunity to learn and grow. One afternoon, the officer was invited to a conference on law enforcement reform. He was nervous, but he knew he had something important to share. Standing in front of hundreds of officers, he spoke not as a man trying to justify himself, but as someone who had lived through fear, made a mistake, and learned to be better. "I was afraid," he said. "That fear made me act without thinking. I didn't consider the person I was dealing with, and I hurt someone in the process. That night could have changed lives in the worst way. But it didn't. Why? Because someone chose patience and understanding over anger. That's a lesson I will never forget. And I hope every one of you remembers it too." The room was silent for a moment, then applause filled the air. Officers approached him afterward, thanking him for his honesty, sharing their own stories of mistakes, fears, and regrets. For the first time in his career, he felt a sense of real purpose. He wasn't just enforcing rules. He was helping people understand the power of restraint and reflection. Tyson, as part of his continuing work, began visiting programs where officers and communities could meet. He spoke about the importance of seeing the human side in everyone, including those who wear uniforms. He didn't preach. He shared experiences. "We all make mistakes," he told the groups, "but we also have the chance to make them right. Sometimes the smallest act of patience can prevent disaster. That's the true measure of strength." It wasn't long before their paths crossed again, not in a moment of tension, but in a space designed for learning and growth. A youth boxing program was hosting a workshop that included both former athletes and local police officers. Tyson had been invited to speak, and the officer was there to support and guide the young participants. When Tyson arrived, the officer greeted him with a nod. There were no awkward words or rehearsed smiles, just mutual respect and acknowledgement of what they had been through. As they watched kids throw punches at the bags, listen to lessons about discipline, and laugh while learning, both men felt the weight of the past slowly lift. Later, they sat down together in the corner of the gym. The officer spoke first. "You know," he said quietly, "I never imagined that night would lead to something like this. Helping kids, teaching lessons. It feels like a second chance." Tyson nodded. "It is a second chance," he replied. "We can't change what happened, but we can decide what it means now. You're turning it into something positive. That's what matters." They didn't need to talk much more. The understanding between them was enough. No one else in the room needed to know the full story. What mattered was that both had grown, and their experience was creating a ripple effect, touching lives far beyond what they could see. Over time, the officer's community work became recognized on a larger scale. He received invitations to speak at conferences, youth programs, and leadership workshops. He didn't seek fame. He didn't care about recognition. He simply wanted to make sure the mistake he had made would serve as a reminder to others about the power of reflection, patience, and humility. Tyson, meanwhile, continued to expand his influence in positive ways. His podcasts, public talks, and charity work reached more people than ever. He often returned to the theme that had defined the story for him. Strength isn't measured in power or aggression, but in self-control and understanding. One day, the officer received a message from Tyson. It was simple, but it meant a lot. Keep walking the right path. What you're doing matters more than you know. The officer smiled, feeling a quiet pride. He had learned that courage wasn't always about fighting. Sometimes it was about facing yourself, owning your mistakes, and trying to do better. The city, too, had begun to notice subtle changes. Police-community relations had improved in areas where officers had taken lessons from the incident to heart. Programs promoting dialogue, empathy, and self-control became more common. People who had once feared confrontation found new ways to communicate and resolve tension. What had started as one split-second mistake was now shaping a culture of reflection and patience. Tyson reflected on this quietly in his own time. He thought about how different the world had been when he first started boxing, when strength was measured only by physical dominance. He had spent years learning to measure strength differently, not just in the ring but in life. That night with the officer and everything that followed had only reinforced his belief. Real power wasn't about striking first. It was about knowing when to step back, when to forgive, and when to guide others. The officer, too, felt the same change internally. He no longer saw his job as merely enforcing rules or controlling fear. He saw it as an opportunity to set an example, to guide, and to show that even mistakes could be turned into lessons. He often thought back to the first time he met Tyson after the incident, the calm, unshakable presence of the man he had almost harmed. That moment had stayed with him as a constant reminder of the importance of perspective and compassion. Years later, both men would reflect on the journey as one of the most important of their lives. The incident that could have ended badly had instead become a catalyst for growth. Tyson continued inspiring people worldwide, sharing lessons of patience and self-awareness. The officer continued to mentor, guide, and teach, helping others learn from his mistake and the forgiveness he received. Their story became an example of how human nature could overcome fear, how mistakes didn't have to define a life, and how one calm response could prevent chaos. It wasn't just about one night outside a club anymore. It was about understanding, growth, and the power of choices. And so, in a quiet way, the world learned from their journey. People began to see that mistakes weren't always the end. They could be the beginning. That anger didn't always have to lead to regret. Patience could lead to change. That fear didn't have to lead to harm. Reflection could lead to wisdom. In the end, it wasn't about the baton or the moment of tension. It was about what came after: forgiveness, understanding, and transformation. And for those who witnessed it, even just through a screen or a story, it remained a quiet but powerful reminder. True strength isn't in what you can hit or stop. It's in how you grow, forgive, and guide yourself and others toward a better path. Tyson and the officer had both found that path. One had chosen calm, the other had chosen reflection. Together, even without trying, they had shown the world that a mistake could become a lesson, fear could become wisdom, and one moment could change countless lives for the better. Years later, when asked about that night in interviews, Tyson would smile quietly and say, "It wasn't about me. It was about what could be learned from a mistake. And if people can take that lesson and use it in their own lives, then everything that happened was worth it." The officer, when asked the same question, would say, "I made a mistake, yes. But that mistake taught me everything I needed to know about myself. I hope others can learn from it too. That's the only way to move forward." And with that, the story ended not in anger, fear, or regret, but in understanding, growth, and the quiet, enduring power of human resilience.